Translation. When Ravana was engaged in the battle, the trunk of the elephant which carried the king of heaven, Indra, broke in pieces, having collided with the chest of Ravana, and the scattered broken parts illuminated all directions. Ravana therefore felt proud of his prowess and began to loiter in the midst of the fighting soldiers, thinking himself the conqueror of all directions. But his laughter, overtaken by joy, along with his very air of life, suddenly ceased with the tingling sound of the bow of Ramachandra, the personality of Godhead. Purport by His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. However powerful a living being may be, when he is condemned by God, no one can save him. And similarly, however weak one may be, if he is protected by the Lord, no one can annihilate him. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate
Om Namo Bhagavate
Vasudevaya.
Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Okay. Thanks everyone for coming to class. Feeling very unqualified to be speaking in front of you all, but also very grateful for the opportunity to dive deeper into Srimad Bhagavatam and receive some purification. So the last two verses that we've been reading from, and this one, have all been on the Leela incarnation of Krishna, Lord Ramachandra. And so we've been hearing all about how Lord Ram is the perfect ideal king. He protects all his citizens perfectly, and everything that he does is for everyone's benefit. And even the, we heard yesterday, Maharaja was explaining, or it said in the purport, Lord Ramachandra had red hot eyes towards Ravana. And, even he's killing Ravana in this particular verse, but it's still all good, it's all beneficial for even Ravana, because Ravana is being liberated from the cycle of birth and death, and from his innate demonic qualities, and it's beneficial for all the citizens of the world. So this is the feature of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is that his mercy might come in hot and cold forms, but it's always good, it's never bad. Ravana, on the other hand, he's pretty much all bad through and through. His name actually means one who makes others cry. And in this verse particularly, it's quite, we can see it, sometimes we see it in ourselves, we get proud, and then the next minute we're smashed down. So it's sort of, this verse is really epitomizing that saying, pride comes before the fall. And the whole backstory of the battle between Lord Ravana and Lord Ram, Ravana is being told by many saintly persons, don't enter into this battle. You're never going to win against Lord Ramachandra, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But because he's so proud, he thinks he will, and he thinks that at this point in particular, he thinks he's the conqueror of all directions. And even he went to Bali Maharaj before the battle and asked for some benedictions to get some strength, but Bali Maharaj said, it's not worth it, you're not gonna win. But he still did it. And even Lord Shiva, because Ravana is a Shiva devotee or Shiva Bhakta, even Lord Shiva couldn't save Ravana. And that's what Prabhupada is saying in the purport, that no one can save someone if it's not the will of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And it is a very short purport. I was a bit nervous because it didn't seem like there was very much to talk about, but actually the more I thought about it, it just encapsulates so much of the philosophy, and so in the end I was able to find a lot to talk about. And so Lord Ravana, he has all the demonic qualities. He's got pride, lust, envy, and he is a real historical figure, but he's also a representation of the demonic qualities in each of our hearts. So the ahankara, the false ego, this is very well presented in the personality of Ravana. And such personalities, they want to be the supreme controller, so they're so envious of Krishna that they don't really acknowledge or accept that he's the all-powerful supreme controller of the universe, of all universes. They think, well, I can beat him, I can battle against him, and I can win. And in Bhagavad Gita, the verse 3:27, it's explained, Prakrite kriyamanani guna karmani sarvasa ahankara vimudatma kartaham iti manyate. The bewildered soul, under the influence of the three modes of material nature, thinks himself the doer of activities which are in actuality carried out by nature. And this is shown in the personality of Ravana. He thought that he could build a staircase to heaven, to the abode of Lord Indra, and defeat Indra, and then all him and his army and his friends could just live in heaven happily. But it's showing he thinks he can be a supreme controller and go against the order of how the living entity would usually get to the heavenly planets, which is pious activities, karma yoga, and getting up in that way which Krishna has established. But demons sort of think that they can artificially manufacture their own way to get what they want. And so ultimately, as shows in this verse, it doesn't quite work. And Krishna always is going to give his mercy, his cold mercy to such demonic personalities. And similarly, Ravana wanted to enjoy, the main thing is he was wanting to enjoy Sita or Lakshmi for himself. And he, usually, Sita isn't happy without Rama. And it's, similarly, it's when we are trying to enjoy the material energy separately from Krishna that we constantly are falling down. So, and the purport, as I said, it's very succinct, very eloquent, and very powerful. It is reminiscent of the Bengali prayer, Rakhe Krishna Mare Ke, Mare Krishna Rakhe Ke, which is, if Krishna wants to kill you, no one can save you, and if Krishna wants to protect you, no one can kill you. So in the battle of Lord Rama and Ravana, actually Ravana's side had a lot more powerful weapons, and his army were all thirsty for blood. Literally, they were blood drinkers and very vicious. And Rama and his brother Lakshman had a bow and some arrows and an army of monkeys. The monkeys had their claws and their teeth, but they didn't have any other advanced weapons. And it's the same in the Battle of Kurukshetra. Arjuna, the Pandavas materially they had a lot less than the Kauravas. The Kauravas, they chose to have Krishna's army instead of Krishna. So, materially speaking, the demonic side is a lot stronger, but yeah, often in Srimad Bhagavatam and in the Vedic text we see that if Krishna's on our side, then he'll make all arrangements for us to advance and succeed in our Krishna consciousness. So, and a similar example is Prahlada Maharaj and Hirani Kashipu. So Ravana was actually Hirani Kashipu in his past life, and so again he was defeated by Lord Nrsingadev, but Hiranyakashipu tried so many times to kill Prahlad, an innocent, seemingly weak and innocent little boy, but because Prahlad had Krishna's protection, he was never able to do so. So the more we read Bhagavatam and the Vedic text, we recognize how Krishna works in that way, how he protects us, even though how he protects his devotees. So, but what I was interested in thinking about was, it's not always so clear in this day and age, because we're all mixed. We're not all 100% demonic or 100% devotees or demigods. We have, Ravana is in our heart, but also we do some pious activities as well. So how does this purport apply to us? So the purport being, however powerful a living being may be, when he is condemned by God, no one can save him. And similarly, however weak one may be, if he is protected by the Lord, no one can annihilate him. So what will make Krishna, in what situation will Krishna save us, and in what situation will he not? But an example that I heard Prahlad Nandaswami talking about is from the Titanic. One of the survivors of the Titanic, they were in the engine room, and they got covered with oil all over their body. And then when the Titanic started to sink, they got sucked out of the engine and into the freezing waters. And anyone else who that happened to froze to death in the waters. But because this man was covered in oil, his body temperature didn't quite go down low enough to die, and then he was able to wait it out until the rescue ship came, and so he was saved. Such a profound situation. God's hand, anyone can see that. But then a year later, he was in the pub, and he got very intoxicated. And he went outside and he slipped over and he drowned in a puddle. So it's not as clear cut as in the Shastras when, there's a demon and Krishna kills them. And we think, okay, that makes sense. very black and white. But this fellow obviously had so much mixed karma, that at that particular moment it wasn't quite time for him to end that body. But a year later it was. So it was arranged that he left his body in that way. And so I think it's an important topic to meditate on a little bit, especially for sharing Krishna consciousness with others, because a lot of people reject God because they think he's unfair, or they don't quite understand why he lets good people suffer and why he lets bad people prosper. It's a very common reason for people to become atheists and become resentful towards God. And it's a question that I've been asked before. I think all of us in a spiritual religious institution probably will be approached by some people asking, how can God do this? And I actually learned that it has been a topic of Western philosophy and theology since ancient Greece, and it's called the problem of evil. And so the earliest philosophical argument came from Epicurus, and this is a quote from him. He's asking, is God willing to prevent evil but not able to? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able to but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? So should I repeat that? Or it's basically, if God is able to prevent evil, if God is willing to prevent evil, but he's not able to, then he's limited. And then if he's able to, but he's not willing, then he's horrible. But if he's both able and willing, then why does suffering exist in this world? And if he's neither able to or willing, then he's not God, so we'll be atheists. So it's really interesting. And then throughout the times, other various Western philosophers, David Hume and also St. Augustine, have approached and tried to tackle this dilemma. And there's a few different approaches. So, for instance, we have the sort of Catholic guilt conception of, instead of thinking of any of this of God, we can shift the blame to ourselves and say, well, it's not God's doing, it's us. We are dirty, we are contaminated, and that's why we're suffering. It's a good first step because it is also in line with karma, where we, as an individual, we recognize that it's our own activities that have planted the seed for future suffering or joy. But in the guilt kind of conclusion, it doesn't really go anywhere, and we end up being scared of God, fearing God, and unable to have an intimate relationship with him. We feel inadequate, sinful. So it doesn't lead to having a loving relationship with him like bhakti does. And then there's another approach which I thought was funny. There's a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and it's a big bestseller. It has been a bestseller by a rabbi, Rabbi Krishna. And in that book, he very systematically goes through all the different options to deal with this problem of evil. But in the end, he decides, actually I should mention, the reason he wrote the book was because his son had this aging disease, where they age prematurely, and then by the time they're 12 or something. They're in an 80-year-old body, and it's very sad and painful, and he lost faith in God when that happened, because he said, I've always been such a good Jew, and now this is what's happening to me. So he lost faith, and in the end of his research, he said, I can worship a God that hates suffering but cannot eliminate it, more than I can worship a God who chooses to make children suffer and die for whatever exalted reason. So he chose the first part of the problem of evil. He's willing to prevent it. God is all kind, all merciful. He doesn't want us to suffer, but he's just not quite able to. And actually, this is quite a kind of condescending conclusion to come to. Is to think, oh, God's a little bit, disabled. He's not quite able to save us, but he wants to. So anyway, that was the conclusion that he came to. And then the atheists, they see the suffering in the world as evidence that God doesn't exist. So they're going for the last part of the problem of evil, that he's neither able to nor willing to, so he basically just doesn't exist. And everything that happens in life, in the cosmos, is just pure randomness by chance. Random laws of material nature. Material nature is the most powerful of the energies, and she just acts randomly. So that's where a lot of atheists, that's their conclusion. And then, there are many different conclusions that over the ages different individuals and collective groups have taken. In Buddhism or Judaism, it's become, they've sort of just taken God out of their religious practice and lifestyle, and so there's still it's like a more practical spiritual culture without worshipping God. And but as the atheists, they think that anything that happens to us is basically chance. In argument to that, Srila Prabhupada says that the concept of chance is for people with a poor fund of knowledge. And he, in a conversation with some of his disciples, he explained it like if a young child walks in front of an automatic door and the door opens, they think, wow, that's such a coincidence. I was just there and then I wanted to go outside and the door opened. So they think it's chance, but they don't understand that there's a higher intelligence behind it, and that's actually the function of the door, is to, censor when someone's there and open. So then comes the hard part, I guess. How do we explain the problem of evil as devotees? And I would love to hear some of the senior devotees explain that after class. Giriraj Swami, he gave a long talk to some students about this topic, and one of the examples he used was if you come into a movie 3/4 of the way through and someone's sitting in an office and they get shot, they get murdered, you're going to think, wow, that was really mean. Like, why did that person get murdered? It was so uncalled for. But then if you watch the rest of the movie up until that point, you realize that he had killed so many people and he had done so many things, which came to that climax of him receiving that situation. And I think before we can explain the problem of evil from a Krishna conscious perspective, there does need to be some acceptance of the basic, basic truths like karma and reincarnation, because that's ultimately what it's about. We can't, if someone doesn't accept those concepts, then it's going to be hard to have a discussion about it. And Sri Prahlada explained that it's the identification with the material nature and the forgetfulness of Krishna's position as the origin and owner of all of creation, and that's the cause of our suffering. So as soon as we identify with the body and the body's desires, the body's urges, that's when we are destined to suffer. And there's also just the acceptance that in this, God doesn't owe us a comfortable, happy life. In this material world, as devotees, we recognize that we're here for a reason, and suffering the miseries of birth, death, old age, and disease are for everyone. There's no one who can escape those sufferings. So it's not just that a certain group of people are suffering. Yes, everyone has different degrees of suffering, but we can't really be in this world without that, unless we turn to Krishna.
The problem with all these theories about God and suffering, that they come to their conclusions based on their own very limited perceptions of the world and the position of God. Now, the real crux of the matter is they have to understand it from God's perspective, and they can't do that directly from their conditioned position, but they can understand through the teachings and through the teachings of the empowered representative, authorized representatives of the Supreme Court. So there are many reasons why things happen, but from our faulty perception or our faulty questioning of it and our faulty conclusion, just like who was the first Greek philosopher?
Epicurus.
Epicurus. So I mean, he is very intelligent, but his intelligence is actually shallow. So he's using his own logic with his own intelligence that's on a mundane level. So therefore he's intelligent enough to ask the questions and come to a certain conclusion, but they're going to be imperfect. So everyone is trying to understand from their perspective, but they have to understand God's perspective and the reasons and the rationale behind, and they have to understand that in an authorized way through bona fide justice and bona fide authorized personalities who will explain these things. And so, I think you often sum the karma and the this and the that and the other. And there's so many different reasons why so many things happen, but you'll never understand from your own perspective. And just like I gave the example of someone walking into the movie theatre 3/4 of the way through, or someone gets shot, but that guy was a killer or a murderer or something like that, and nothing. So you don't understand, but you're concluding. We've had many lives where we've acted in so many ways, and the child had to get that suffering because in the previous life, so many things. So there's many answers, but the main, I think, the main thing is to understand it from Krishna's perspective, and you have to do that in the right way to be able to come to some idea of why these things are going on, where the whole direction is going, what the overall picture is. Otherwise, you'll never be able to come to a bottom.
Yeah, so basically that's the point that as we accept Sastra, it's just going to be our own speculation. Everybody's very proud of their own knowledge, but they say, oh, what's the evidence? And you say, well, Scripture's the evidence, but if they don't accept that, well, it's just in your mind, basically. And Nectar Devotion mentions that the cause of suffering is threefold: as ignorance, the desire to sin, and the sin itself. And primarily it comes from ignorance, and the main point of ignorance is that we're identifying with the body. So unless they come to understand this very first step, mathematics 1 = 2, if you can't accept that point, it doesn't matter how advanced your mathematics is going to be, it's not going to work out. So unless you get the ABCs right, I'm not the body, I've had previous lives, etc., then the calculation is just going to be speculative.
I just wanted to read a quote that I saw the other day from Maharaja. It says, when you go back to Godhead and ask Krishna why he had to go through all the suffering, why he couldn't have minimized it, he's going to say, because if I minimized it, you wouldn't be here right now. And that reminded me of a few verses from the Bhagavatam that Krishna gave my Guru shared with me about Krishna and karma, and how as devotees, Krishna can alter our karma more or less depending on what will make us more inclined to come back to him. So even if we're, have done so many good deeds or whatnot, if we are attached to the material world still, if we're attached to our bodies, then Krishna will put us through some suffering and some hardships to make us detach from these kinds of things, so that we turn to him, like in Queen Kunti's prayers where she asks for these troublesome times, because then she can really turn to Krishna. That's when it's the most intense amount of, I really need you. So in that way, then if we don't go through the suffering, then we don't understand that the material world is not a nice place to be in. It's actually, we only see that through going through the suffering.
Yeah. There's no good or bad as such. It's how we deal with the situation. Yeah.
I was reading something the other day about Western philosophers, and actually many of them, even Socrates or Plato, their knowledge is derived from Vedic physics existing authorized philosophical schools, and one of them is Karma. And so that one, the experience, it looks very much like it. For example, God exists, there is karma, but what they say is that God cannot, make an intervention within karma. But you could also say, well, he can, but he doesn't, because we have free will. So if he does intervene all the time, it's like we're like puppets. So like, for example, you're forcing someone to love you. You can't do that, So that's why the soul has free will, and that's the origin of every single material condition. So God obviously, otherwise he's omnipotent, he can do anything, and nothing moves without his will. But he doesn't move it just because even the whole existence, even in the Bhagavatam it says that even the lotus flower, that's sprouted from Vishnu, is made of fruitive activities of the living entities. That's in the Bhagavatam. So that means that every single thing that is happening here is a result of, karmic activity and desire. So God can, it's like saying, you have a child and your child chooses to do a certain thing, and you're not going to drag the child by force and make it do another thing, So it's all based on free will, and the way I see it, the 6 philosophy school, authorized according to Krishna, it negates the fact that God makes intervention in karma, he can, and he doesn't. So I was just seeing the link between that. It's very interesting what you said. I really like that.
Yeah, I guess God intervening, some people think it's cruel for him not to intervene, but as you say, we do have our free will. But then there's an argument that, if we are his children, his helpless children, because some people think that testing, in the educational system, testing is not necessary. It's a bit cruel that kids should learn through experience. I don't think that, but so that's another argument that I came across, was that, you know, it would be more compassionate to help them instead of testing them.
Then you are overriding the free will, right? Because it's the living entity who wants to do things that is not connected to God. Then if you make an intervention because you know that that person is going to suffer, then you override the free will. You're just manipulating the living entities.
Ajita?
The Prabhupada says one is protected, one is weak. What does it mean to be weak? What does it mean to be weak? Krishna protects the weak one. What does it mean to be weak?
Well, I guess I just looked at it in examples from the Shastra. So Prahlada Maharaj is a young child, which is generally weak, but because he has such devotion, Krishna protected him through everything. So physically weak, yeah.
Also,
Yeah, because it's very different definitions of weak.
Yeah.
I feel like it's not necessarily the word weak. I know I'm just reflecting on perhaps my own experiences where it may be perceived as weakness, but if you take shelter of Krishna and you're surrendering to him and you're saying, like when Draupadi put her hands up and she goes, Krishna, I surrender. It's like you're the only one who can stand up for me now. And so, in a way, that may be perceived as weakness, but actually it was strength through surrender.
Mm-hmm.
That was when Krishna stepped in and went, I brought you. So from my own experience, he's always done that. Every time you're like, okay, Krishna, I just can't do this without you. So perhaps that may be a definition of, it may look to some people like, oh, you're just giving up, you're just being weak. But it's actually the surrender. And it's interesting how we all take birth this material world for our own choice, but we're always indignant when, you know, we have to be, things are imposed upon us. You know, how dare you making us do something? It's like, well, we kind of came here, and we're going to get old, we're going to get sick, and we're going to die. And like this, you can't escape that. So it's part of the conditioned soul's need to like fight back all the time. But until we actually do that surrender, through service to Krishna, that's when it's the only time that we can actually feel free from the suffering of the material energy, is when we're in service. Because then we leave the mind behind, and even the body. Sometimes we don't feel the body when we're serving. So
it could also be in comparison compared to the powerful, because in the verse it's talking about how powerful Ravana is, and so then to make that point clearer, it explains the opposite. If someone's weak, Krishna protects them.
With indulge me, I was going to read, if you don't mind, this is one verse, and this first paragraph of the very long verse, which I think summarises this topic a little bit. This is from the 10th canto, 87th chapter, text number 2, Sukadeva Goswami said, the Supreme Lord manifested the material intelligence, senses, mind, and vital air of the living entities so that they could indulge their desires of sense gratification, take repeated birth, to engage in fruitive activities, become elevated in future lives, and ultimately attain liberation. So in the purport says, at the dawn of creation, when the conditioned living entities lay dormant within the transcendental body of Lord Vishnu, he initiated the process of creation by sending forth the coverings of intelligence, mind, and so forth for the living entity's benefit. As stated here, Vishnu is the independent Lord, Prabhu, and the living entities are his jana, dependents. Thus, we should understand that the Lord creates the cosmos entirely for the living entity's sake. Compassion is his sole motive. Summarises the topic a bit.
So he's powerful and compassionate.
Yeah, this is just for us to get our act together.
Jai. Okay. Srimad Bhagavatam. Ki Jai.